Sometimes the most ordinary moments hide the most extraordinary stories. Behind closed doors, in familiar neighborhoods, lives unfold with secrets, betrayals, and acts of courage that can change everything. In the story you're about to hear, I will take you deep into one such journey. A tale of dignity reclaimed and lessons learned at a heavy price. To protect their private lives, I've changed their names and locations, but every emotion and event remains true. So lean in, listen closely, and let yourself be moved. And if you haven't already subscribed, hit the subscribe button now so you won't miss our newest stories. Don't forget to like the video and leave a comment saying, "I'm listening," so we can stay connected and share this journey together. It was the evening of May 12th, 2023. The sun had just dipped behind the Hudson River, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. Inside Hudson's Terrace, a sleek restaurant at 621 W 46th Street, New York, waiters in crisp black uniforms glided between round tables covered with white linen and flickering candles. A jazz trio in the corner played a mellow version of Autumn Leaves. Glasses clinked, guests laughed politely, and the scent of seared scallops and rosemary drifted through the air. Susan Miller, a 62-year-old retired schoolteacher from Brooklyn, stood near the tall windows with a champagne flute in hand. She wore a simple navy dress with a string of pearls, her gray hair swept into a neat bun. She had come to her son's engagement party to celebrate, not to be humiliated. Across the room, Lauren Carter, 30, with a sleek Manhattan PR look. White jumpsuit, designer heels, perfectly lined lips, whispered something sharp to Connor Miller. 34, he, in his tailored suit, nodded nervously, eyes flicking toward his mother. As the music swelled and a waiter passed with hors d'oeuvres, Lauren suddenly strode toward Susan. Her heels clicked against the wooden floor, cutting through the chatter. She stopped only inches away. "You're selfish," she hissed, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You refused to transfer the Park Slope house to us like you promised." A murmur spread through the crowd. Susan blinked, stunned, holding her glass a little tighter. "Lauren, this isn't the place," she began softly. But before the sentence could leave her lips, Lauren's hand shot out. Smack. The sound cracked across the room. Susan's champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the parquet floor, spraying golden liquid across her shoes. The jazz trio stopped mid-note. The bass player froze, bow still in hand. 150 guests turned in unison, like a theater audience at a sudden twist. Connor stood rooted to the spot near the bar, his face pale. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. A guest near the windows muttered, "Oh my God." Another fumbled for their phone. Susan's cheek burned, but she refused to raise her hand to it. She straightened her shoulders, though her heart hammered. "Lauren, you're going too far," she managed, her voice trembling but still gentle. Lauren's eyes glittered with anger. "You're not welcome in this family anymore," she declared, voice echoing against the high ceilings. Someone gasped. A waiter bent to pick up the broken glass but hesitated, sensing the tension. Susan's fingers twitched as if to steady herself on the chair beside her, but she stood upright instead. She scanned the sea of faces, pity, curiosity, judgment, like knives pressing into her skin. In that frozen moment, with the taste of humiliation and champagne in the air, Susan understood something had snapped. A boundary she had tried to preserve for years had been publicly crossed. She felt the sting on her cheek, the weight of eyes upon her, and a quiet, fierce clarity rising from somewhere deep inside. This was the night everything would change. For 2 long years, Susan Miller had been swallowing small cuts of humiliation, each sharper than the last. She could trace it back to the very first day Lauren Carter stepped into her modest apartment. Unit 3G at 254 7th Avenue, a pre-war brick building with creaky wooden stairs and a faint smell of old books from the hallway. Susan had set out a tray of tea and homemade lemon cookies, proud of her little corner of Brooklyn. But as soon as Lauren crossed the threshold, she wrinkled her nose. "This place is so outdated," she said, running a manicured finger along the edge of Susan's oak bookshelf. "All this dark wood and old furniture. Don't you ever think of selling?" Her voice was sweet, but the words sliced like paper cuts. Connor, standing behind her, shifted uncomfortably before muttering what had become a refrain. Mom, maybe you should think about selling the house. We could really build our future if you did. He glanced at Lauren, looking for approval. Susan's hands trembled as she poured tea into chipped china cups she had owned for decades. This home has been good to me, she said quietly. But her smile didn't reach her eyes. That scene replayed in different forms over the next 2 years. Every Sunday dinner, every casual visit, Lauren would drop comments about wasting space or how dangerous it is for an older woman to live alone. Connor, once her protective boy, now echoed the suggestions like a script. Each remark was a small blade to her dignity. Yet outwardly, Susan played the role she had chosen for herself, the frugal, slightly shabby retired teacher. She wore second-hand cardigans from a thrift shop on Flatbush Avenue, carried a canvas tote instead of a designer bag, and still used the Metro card for the bus instead of hailing taxis. On weekday afternoons, she tutored algebra and geometry to immigrant kids at the Brooklyn Public Library, not for income, but because she loved watching the light of understanding flicker in a student's eyes. Neighbors thought of her as the sweet old math lady. Even Connor believed she was scraping by on a small pension. In truth, the image was a deliberate shield. She had learned long ago, from her late husband, from years in public schools, that money could invite envy, and envy could destroy families. So she hid. Her bank statements were locked in a fireproof box. Her investments were managed quietly by a discreet advisor. Lauren, however, saw only weakness. Each time she stepped into Susan's apartment, she treated the faded armchairs and stacks of library books like evidence of incompetence. She whispered to Connor that his mother was clinging to a past she can't afford. Susan overheard enough to understand their plan, but she said nothing. At night, lying awake under her crocheted blanket, she stared at the ceiling fan turning slowly and thought, "I've endured enough. My silence is no longer protecting anyone." She rolled onto her side, watching the glow of the street lamp spill across her wooden floorboards. In the stillness, she whispered to herself, "This ends soon." The words felt heavier than a promise. They felt like the start of a decision forming deep in her chest, one that would change the shape of her family forever. Very few people in New York knew who Susan Miller had once been. To her neighbors, she was just the quiet retired math teacher from Brooklyn with a canvas tote bag and a gentle smile. But behind that unassuming image lay a chapter she rarely spoke of. In 2005, back in Boston, she and her late husband John Miller had co-founded BrightLearn, an educational software startup built out of their cramped kitchen, where Susan wrote lesson plans and John coded late into the night. They sold the company a decade later, in 2015, for $7.2 million. After John died of pancreatic cancer in 2018, Susan decided to retreat from the public eye. She moved back to Brooklyn, living simply, investing quietly, and teaching kids for free at the library. Lauren Carter and the rest of the Carter family never saw that part of her life. To them, she was just the poor old math lady blocking their future inheritance. Susan still remembered the brunch at a trendy cafe in Soho 2 years earlier. White marble tables, $14 avocado toast, the smell of truffle oil. Lauren had been flashing her diamond engagement ring under the sunlight like a trophy. Her mother leaned across the table and whispered, not quite low enough. She should be in a retirement home, not rattling around that apartment by herself. The words hit Susan like acid on bare skin. She sipped her black coffee to hide the sting, smiling faintly, but inside she felt the ground shift. "I'm fine where I am," she had said gently. But no one at the table looked at her. Connor had kept scrolling on his phone. Lauren had launched into a story about a new PR client, and the moment had passed, at least on the surface. That afternoon, walking back to the subway on Prince Street, Susan clutched her tote bag tighter than usual. Inside it was a worn leather wallet, a small spiral notebook of her tutoring schedule, and a business card she had kept for years. David Ramos, financial advisor. David, a soft-spoken man from Queens with a shock of white hair, had managed her accounts since the BrightLearn sale. She had barely needed to call him in the past few years, but tonight she felt the pull of his number like a lifeline. Back in her apartment, the sky outside turning a dusky purple, Susan boiled water for tea. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She stared at David's name on the screen for a long moment, hearing the echo of Lauren's mother's words in her head. Finally, she pressed call. "David," she said when he answered, her voice low but steady. "Tomorrow. My apartment. I need all the files." She paused, swallowing hard. "It's time." There was a silence on the line, then David's calm reply. "Are you sure, Susan? Once we start, we can't go back." She closed her eyes, feeling both fear and resolve settle into her chest. "I'm sure," she whispered. Hanging up, she set the phone down and looked around her modest living room. The old oak bookshelves, the thrift store armchair, the crocheted blanket on the sofa. To anyone else, it was a picture of smallness, only she knew it was armor. Tomorrow, she would begin to take it off. At exactly 10:07 p.m., Susan's phone vibrated on the small kitchen table, its screen lighting up the dim room. She had just made herself chamomile tea but hadn't touched it. The steam curled upward as she picked up. On the other end was David Ramos, her longtime financial advisor from Queens. His voice, normally calm and unhurried, sounded taut. "Are you absolutely sure, Susan?" he asked. "Once we make these moves public, there's no going back." Susan's eyes drifted to a framed photo on the shelf above the radiator. Connor at 8 years old, gap-toothed, holding a paper airplane he had made with her in Prospect Park. The memory pressed against her ribs like a fist. "I've been silent for too long," she said quietly. "Tomorrow we start." She ended the call before doubt could sneak in. The next evening, the air around Penn Station smelled of diesel and soft pretzels. Taxis honked, steam hissed from manholes. Susan sat in her old 2009 Toyota Corolla in a shadowed corner of the parking lot, fingers gripping the steering wheel, watching commuters stream past under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her tote bag rested on the passenger seat, a yellow post-it sticking out of a folder marked "Confidential." She checked the clock on the dashboard. 8:42 p.m. David was due any minute with the documents that would change everything. While she waited, memories unspooled like an old film reel. She saw again the first time Connor had brought Lauren to meet her, back in 2021. The girl had glided into the apartment with polished blonde hair, a red designer coat, and Christian Louboutin heels that clicked on the hardwood floor. Susan had prepared chicken soup and fresh bread, but Lauren barely glanced at the table before asking, smiling brightly, "So, do you have any plans to sign the house over to Connor?" Susan remembered forcing a chuckle, ladling soup into bowls while her stomach knotted. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," she had murmured. But in her mind a small alarm bell had gone off. She began to watch Lauren the way a chess player watches an opponent, mapping every move in her head. Each time Lauren cooed, "Your apartment is so cozy." Susan noticed her eyes sweeping across the living room, measuring square footage, calculating resale value. In the car now, she rubbed her temples. The roar of a train overhead vibrated through the asphalt. She whispered to herself, "No more pretending." Her heart beat faster but steadier than she expected. A knock on the passenger window startled her. David, in his worn leather jacket and carrying a thick brown envelope, leaned down. "You ready?" he asked through the glass. Susan unlocked the door. "Yes," she said, voice low but firm. "It's time." As he slid into the seat beside her, handing over the papers, she felt a strange mix of grief and relief. This wasn't revenge, she told herself. This was reclaiming her dignity. Outside, the city churned on, oblivious. But for Susan, the night marked the beginning of a different future. On the surface, Lauren Carter looked like the picture of a dutiful future daughter-in-law. She would smile warmly across the table at Susan, tilt her head in that practiced way and say, "I just worry about you, Susan. Living alone at your age. It's not safe." Every few days a new email or text would arrive with links to top 10 retirement homes in New York or Glossy, articles about how downsizing improves senior health. Connor would repeat the lines as if on cue. "Mom, you should think about moving. It'd be safer for you." The words stung, but Susan forced a polite nod. taking mental notes with the precision of the math teacher she once was. At their weekly lunches, usually at a cafe near Bryant Park, Lauren escalated her performance. She would place a brochure next to Susan's coffee cup. Photos of manicured gardens, smiling staff in pastel uniforms, slogans about freedom without worry. "Just look at this one in New Jersey," she'd chirp, flipping a page. Private rooms, wellness center, even a shuttle to Manhattan. "You'd love it there." Susan would stir her tea slowly, eyes fixed on the swirling liquid. "It's very nice," she would murmur. But inside, she felt the walls tightening. Back in her Park Slope apartment, Susan began to keep a small notebook. She wrote down each suggestion, each brochure, each offhand comment Connor parroted. On some nights, she sat at the kitchen table reading over the entries, her pen hovering in midair. She had always believed in her son's goodness. Now she wondered how much of his voice was still his own. Finally, she decided she needed facts. She called Thomas Green, an old friend from her teaching days who had since become a real estate broker in Williamsburg. They met in a small diner on Bedford Avenue, a plate of pancakes between them. Thomas leaned in, voice low. "What do you need me to find out?" he asked. Susan looked around the room, a mother feeding a toddler, a busboy wiping a counter, then back at her friend. "Their finances," she whispered. "Everything you can." He nodded without hesitation. "Give me a week." The report he brought back was worse than she imagined. Connor and Lauren were drowning. $98,000 in credit card debt. 3 months behind on the engagement party venue payments. A $5,000 a month lease on an Upper East Side apartment they could barely cover. Thomas slid the papers across the booth table. "They're counting on you," he said gently. Susan stared at the numbers until they blurred. She heard Lauren's voice in her head. "It's all for your safety, Susan," and felt a chill run through her. That night, sitting by the window with the city lights flickering below, she whispered to herself, "My son has become a tool in her plan." Her fingers tightened around her mug of chamomile tea. The patience that had defined her for years shifted, like a rope fraying at the end. Quiet endurance was turning into a quiet, steely resolve. She closed the notebook, pushed the brochures into a drawer, and thought, enough. This game ends soon. 2 weeks before the glittering engagement party, Susan Miller's quiet Park Slope apartment became the stage for something she had never imagined. It was a gray Saturday afternoon in late April. Rain streaked down the old bay window as she laid out a plate of oatmeal cookies and a pot of chamomile tea, a habit she had kept since her teaching days. She wanted to be gracious, even though the invitation for a family meeting had left her uneasy. At precisely 2:00, the doorbell rang. Lauren's parents, Edward and Marjorie Carter, stepped in first, Edward in a navy blazer smelling faintly of expensive aftershave, Marjorie clutching a Louis Vuitton tote. Behind them came Connor and Lauren. Connor avoided his mother's eyes, shuffling his feet on the worn rug. Lauren, immaculate in a cream dress, beamed with a sugary smile. "We just thought it would be nice to talk, Mom," she said, settling onto the couch as though she owned it. Susan poured tea into cups, hands steady but her heart racing. Edward cleared his throat. "At your age, Susan, living alone can be dangerous," he began, his tone rehearsed. "We just want what's best for you." Connor nodded like a student agreeing with a lecture. "Yeah, Mom, it's about safety," he mumbled. Lauren leaned forward, voice soft, eyes bright. "There's a center in Westchester, full service, 24/7 care. You'd love it there, really." She slid a glossy brochure across the coffee table, smiling seniors in sunlit common rooms. "You'd have company, activities. It's so much better than being alone." Susan's fingers tightened on her cup. "And my home?" she asked evenly. Her question hung in the air. No one met her gaze. The rain ticked against the window like a clock. Finally, Marjorie spoke, her voice a shade too sweet. "You can't manage this place forever. Let us help you. We'll take care of everything." Something inside Susan shifted. She set her cup down carefully and looked at her son. His eyes were downcast, his hands clasped as though in prayer. The boy who once brought her wildflowers from Prospect Park now sat silent while strangers plotted her future. She felt not fear, but a slow, spreading grief, the kind that comes when an illusion dies. That night, after they left with their untouched cookies and brochures, Susan sat at the kitchen table under the dim pendant light. She didn't wipe away the tears that slipped down her cheeks. They felt honest, necessary. She picked up her phone and typed a message to David Ramos. "Investigate everything. I need to know if they're trying to mortgage my house." The reply came minutes later. "On it. I'll dig." Susan closed her eyes, breathing through the ache in her chest. She already sensed the answer. 2 days later, David called with confirmation. Connor had been inquiring at a bank about a home equity loan on the Park Slope property. The news landed like a physical blow. She pressed the phone to her ear, staring at the photo of Connor as a child taped to her fridge. "So it's true," she whispered. That betrayal, more than the slap or the brochures, was the real strike at her heart, and it hardened her resolve like nothing else. 3 nights after the tense family meeting, Susan sat alone at her kitchen table in Park Slope. The rain had stopped, and the city outside hummed with late-night traffic, but inside her apartment, only the glow of her laptop lit the room. She clicked open a new message from David Ramos. The subject line read simply, "Confidential. Read carefully." Her heart thudded as she entered the password he'd given her over the phone. A set of neatly labeled PDFs appeared. Credit cards, bank transfers, rental agreements. David had always been discreet, but tonight his tone in the email was almost apologetic. "I'm sorry you have to see it this way," she began scrolling. Line after line of payments stared back at her. $1,200 here to cover a missed rent payment. $4,300 to pay off a maxed-out card. $7,800 wired just last month to cover wedding costs. For 3 years, she had been quietly rescuing Connor from financial cliffs, believing each time would be the last. Seeing it all in black and white felt like a punch to the stomach. She pushed her chair back, walked to the sink, and splashed cold water on her face. In the hallway, the old wall clock ticked steadily. "I did this," she whispered to her reflection in the dark window. "I built the net he fell into." Returning to the table, she opened the second file. It was a summary of her own holdings that David had compiled at her request. Most people, even her son, thought the Park Slope brownstone was her only asset. In reality, it was just one piece of a life she and John had built. A $5.8 million portfolio of conservative investments, an airy 2-bedroom condo in Cape Cod, where they had once spent summers teaching Connor to fish, a stack of educational bonds earmarked for scholarships. She touched the photo of John on the bookshelf, remembering his voice. "Keep it quiet, Susie. Privacy is your best defense." But the numbers on the screen didn't comfort her. They only underlined the real loss, years of kindness met with entitlement. She heard again Lauren's mother at that brunch in Soho, the brochures, the rehearsed concern. All of it now looked like a strategy. Her phone buzzed. A new message from David. "We can stop all transfers immediately. Do you want me to draft the termination documents?" Susan stared at the text for a long moment, feeling the weight of 3 decades of motherhood press on her chest. Then she typed back, "Yes. Prepare everything. Bring it to the engagement party." She hit send, exhaled, and closed the laptop with a quiet snap. The apartment seemed to hold its breath with her. She poured herself a small glass of wine, standing at the window, watching the lights of a passing taxi streak across the wet street. "This time," she murmured, "the silence ends." For the first time in months, her spine straightened, and she felt not just hurt, but a clear, cold determination rising. In 2 weeks, she would walk into that celebration, not as the meek old math teacher, but as the woman who had finally decided to draw a line. The chandeliers at Hudson's Terrace glimmered above rows of white-clothed tables as if nothing were amiss. But at 7:48 p.m., the jazz trio in the corner faltered mid-song, the saxophone squealing and then falling silent. Heads turned toward the entrance where David Ramos, in a dark suit and carrying a leather briefcase, walked purposefully toward the small stage. Behind him came Susan Miller, her posture upright, a neat navy dress and pearls glinting under the lights. She no longer looked like a timid retiree. There was a steadiness in her step that even the 150 guests could feel. "Ladies and gentlemen," David said into the microphone, his Queen's accent crisp but calm. "We have some urgent matters to clarify before this evening continues." A ripple of whispers moved through the room. Several guests lifted their phones instinctively. Lauren Carter, standing near the cake table, blinked as if she'd seen a ghost. Connor shifted beside her, his collar suddenly too tight. Susan climbed the 2 steps to the stage, her heels clicking on the polished wood. She took a deep breath and unfolded a stack of papers David handed her. The murmur in the room deepened into a hush. One by one she signed, her hand steady: cancellation of all financial transfers to Connor, termination of the lease guarantee on their Upper East Side apartment, withdrawal of the payment authorization for tonight's party. She held the microphone and her voice came out clear, ringing to the far corners of the hall. "This is not revenge," she said. "This is justice. I have supported my son and his fiancée for years, but tonight I am reclaiming my dignity." A gasp broke from the crowd. Lauren's perfectly made-up face went pale. "No!" she burst out, her voice rising to a shriek. "This can't be happening. You're poor. You said you were poor." Her hands fluttered toward Connor as if to steady herself. Connor stared at the floor, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Phones went up all over the room, little red record lights blinking. David began reading each clause aloud like a litany: the dates of transfers, the sums covered, the debts now returned to the couple. Guests whispered to each other. "She's been paying for everything?" "Did you hear the numbers?" Their expressions shifting from confusion to awe. On the stage, Susan stood very still. Inside, her heart hammered, but on the outside she was calm, even regal. She let her eyes rest on the 2 people who had once thought they were winning some unspoken game. For a moment, Connor looked up and met her gaze. Something like shame flickered there. Lauren clutched his arm, whispering furiously. A waiter backed into a corner, holding a tray of untouched champagne. Somewhere a phone chimed with a notification, but no one moved to silence it. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of courtroom and theater. Susan took a step closer to the microphone. "I raised my son to be honest," she said quietly. "I will not bankroll manipulation." Her voice didn't waver. For the first time in years, she felt taller, as if a weight had rolled off her shoulders. In that charged silence, with cameras clicking and whispers circling like wind, Susan Miller reclaimed the stage of her own life. She was no longer the poor old math teacher. She was the woman drawing a line in public, and everyone there could feel it. The room at Hudson's Terrace had gone from a glittering engagement party to something resembling a courtroom. Chandeliers still threw their warm light across the parquet floor, but it only served to illuminate pale faces and clenched jaws. David Ramos adjusted his glasses, opened his briefcase with deliberate slowness, and drew out another sheaf of papers. He held them up for everyone to see, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "Here are the records," he announced, his tone neither angry nor triumphant, just factual. $185,000, Susan Miller's personal funds, used over 3 years to pay Mr. Connor Miller's credit cards, rent arrears, and private loans. $45,000 guaranteed for this engagement party alone. The numbers hung in the air like a thunderclap. Guests gasped, some covering their mouths, others whispering behind raised hands. At one table, a man muttered, "My God, she's been bankrolling them." The smell of spilled champagne mingled with perfume and panic. Lauren Carter's eyes widened, her mascara smudging under the hot lights. She let out a ragged cry. "You can't do this to us!" she shouted, her voice breaking as she stepped forward, heels clicking sharply on the tile. "This is our future, our wedding, our life. You can't just pull the rug out from under us." Susan, still standing by the microphone, did not flinch. She held herself straighter, fingers loosely interlaced in front of her. Inside, her heart was hammering, but her voice when it came was steady and almost cool. "For 3 years, she said, I thought you would come to your senses. I thought my son would realize the difference between support and exploitation. But I was wrong." Connor, standing beside Lauren, finally found his voice. He stepped forward, hands slightly outstretched like a child reaching for comfort. "Mom," he pleaded, his voice hoarse, please don't do this. Just help us one more time, just this once. I swear we'll make it right." His eyes glistened as he searched her face for the softness he had always found there. Susan looked at him, and for a split second, she saw the boy who used to fall asleep on her lap after math homework. That memory ached like a bruise. Then she shook her head. "The only way I can save you now," she said quietly, "is by not saving you anymore." "You need to save yourself, Connor." A murmur of surprise rippled through the guests. Someone in the back whispered, "She's cutting him off for good." David cleared his throat and spoke again, his tone formal. "Mrs. Miller has also amended her will," he announced. "All major assets have been reassigned to the Elder Defense Fund, a non-profit established to protect seniors from financial exploitation." The words landed like a final gavel strike. Lauren's knees seemed to buckle. She grabbed the back of a chair for support, her face blotched with disbelief. No, she stammered. "That money, that house. We were counting on—" Her voice trailed into a sob. Susan's eyes met Lauren's directly for the first time that night. Her voice was firm but not loud, cutting through the murmurs with surgical precision. "This isn't about losing money," she said. "This is about losing your character. That's a far greater loss." The hall went silent. Even the waiters froze. Trays suspended midair. In that moment, everyone could feel the tectonic shift. A mother severing the lifeline she had extended for too long. A woman turning private humiliation into public boundary. Connor stared at the floor, jaw trembling. Lauren clutched his arm, but he didn't respond. Around them, the guests began to realize they were witnessing not just a family scandal, but a turning point in someone's life. And on the stage, Susan Miller, hands steady, felt a strange calm settle over her. She had crossed the point of no return, but for the first time in years, she felt free. The room had fallen into a heavy, stunned quiet. Moments earlier, Hudson's Terrace had been alive with clinking glasses and jazz standards. Now the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the tremble of a champagne flute rolling across the parquet floor. Lauren Carter sat slumped in a gold-backed chair near the stage. Her once luxurious ivory gown, perfect just an hour ago, now hung limp and wrinkled, the sequins catching light like fallen stars. She pressed a trembling hand to her forehead, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Connor Miller stood behind her, a man torn between shame and panic. He placed his hand hesitantly on his fiancée's shoulder, as if unsure whether to comfort her or himself. "Lauren," he whispered, but his voice cracked. His tie was loosened, his collar damp with sweat. He looked around at the crowd, the neighbors, old college friends, colleagues from Manhattan, every eye trained on them, some wide with sympathy, others gleaming with judgment. Susan Miller, 62, stood a few feet away, clutching a folded sheaf of papers. She walked slowly toward the couple, her low heels clicking against the polished wood floor. Her heart was still racing from what she'd just done, cutting off the lifeline she had extended for years, but her face showed only composure. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of herself she had given away. When she reached them, she spoke softly but firmly, her words carrying through the hushed hall. "What you've lost tonight isn't money," she said, her eyes moving from Lauren to Connor. "It's compassion. It's the decency and trust that should hold a family together." Connor blinked rapidly, as if trying to wake up from a nightmare. "Mom," he began, his voice unsteady. We can fix this, can't we? We can change." He squeezed Lauren's shoulder tighter, as though her presence could anchor him. "We didn't mean to." Susan's gaze softened for a moment, and then she shook her head. "You can," she replied gently, "but only by changing yourselves. Not by taking more, not by manipulating, by becoming better people." Her words were not a rebuke, but a kind of benediction, firm but not cruel. Around them, guests held their breath. A waiter set down a tray of untouched canapés and backed away quietly. Someone's phone camera flashed. At the far end of the room, an elderly woman dabbed her eyes with a cocktail napkin. The atmosphere felt like the aftermath of a storm, furniture toppled, air heavy, but a strange clarity emerging. Lauren finally lifted her head. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "We just wanted a future." Her voice was small now, stripped of its earlier venom. "We thought—" But she trailed off, unable to finish. Susan reached into her bag, pulled out her car keys and held them loosely in her palm. She didn't say "I told you so." Instead, she took one last look at Connor, the boy she had raised alone, the man she no longer recognized. "I hope you find your way," she said softly. Then she turned and walked toward the exit, her heels echoing like a metronome in the cavernous space. David Ramos, her financial advisor, fell into step beside her, holding the briefcase that had changed everything. Behind them, the guests slowly began to stir, whispering to each other as though awakening from a dream. Some reached for their coats. Others kept filming, sensing they had witnessed something raw and real. As Susan stepped out into the cool May night, the neon lights of Midtown reflecting off her glasses, she inhaled deeply. For the first time in years, the air felt light, uncluttered. She was no longer the poor retired teacher in Brooklyn. She was Susan Miller, the woman who had built a company, buried a husband, raised a son, and tonight reclaimed her dignity. The city roared around her, indifferent and vast, but she walked with a quiet certainty. Behind her, the party continued in disarray. Ahead of her, the street opened like a clean slate. Susan Miller paused at the edge of the stage at Hudson's Terrace. The jazz band had long since stopped playing. Their instruments sat silent, like abandoned props. The once festive hall now felt like a courtroom after a verdict. All eyes followed her as she descended the small steps, her navy dress brushing against her knees. She tightened her grip on the leather folder of papers that had severed years of silent sacrifice. Connor stood near the center of the room, his face pale under the chandeliers. Lauren was beside him, clutching a crumpled napkin to her mouth. The two of them looked like statues that had suddenly cracked. Susan walked straight toward her son. Her heels clicked on the polished wooden floor, steady, unhurried, echoing through the stunned silence. She stopped just a foot away from Connor. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. His eyes darted between his mother and the crowd, like a child caught misbehaving in public. Susan inhaled deeply, then said in a voice that carried to the far corners of the hall, "Connor, you're going to have to learn to live without my money, without the Park Slope house, without an inheritance." Her tone was calm, but each word cut clean. A collective murmur rippled through the guests, then died instantly. The only sound left was the soft sobbing of Lauren as she hid her face in her hands. David Ramos, standing discreetly at the side, stepped forward and placed a steadying hand on Susan's elbow. "Are you ready?" he whispered. She gave him a small nod, but kept her eyes on her son. Connor's lips trembled. "Mom," he said hoarsely, "I didn't think—" His voice cracked. "I thought you'd always be there." He reached out a hand, but let it fall back, unsure whether she'd take it. Lauren's shoulders shook beside him, mascara streaks staining her cheeks. Susan's heart clenched at the sight, but she held firm. "I was there," she replied quietly, "for years, and you mistook my kindness for weakness." Her gaze softened just a little, enough for Connor to see the love still buried under the disappointment. "Now you must stand on your own." From the back of the room, someone whispered, awed, "I've never seen anyone this brave." Another guest raised a phone but lowered it again, sensing this moment was too raw to exploit. The hush returned, heavy and reverent, like a church before a prayer. Susan turned toward the exit. Her heels struck the floor like a metronome, each click sealing off an illusion she had once maintained. Connor and Lauren remained frozen, one pale and stunned, the other trembling and tear-streaked. David followed close behind, his expression respectful, as though escorting a dignitary from a ceremony. As she reached the door, Susan paused for a heartbeat. The May night waited outside, cool and open, neon lights flickering across 11th Avenue. She drew in a long breath of New York air tinged with the scent of the Hudson and distant street food. The noise of the city wrapped around her, alive and indifferent. In that moment, Susan felt both pain and release. The severing of ties hurt like tearing muscle from bone, but underneath the ache was a new current. Freedom. She had drawn her boundary at last. Without looking back, she pushed open the glass door and stepped into the night, leaving behind the hall, the whispers, and a lifetime of being underestimated. For the first time in years, she was walking entirely on her own terms. Susan Miller had just pushed open the glass door of Hudson's terrace when a young voice called out behind her, echoing across the marble-floored lobby. "Susan, wait for me." The words were soft but urgent, carrying a tremor of desperation. Susan turned, her hand still on the chrome handle. There, at the far end of the hall, was Emma Carter, 22, a second-year medical student at Columbia University, her long brown hair slipping out of a loose ponytail as she hurried forward. She clutched her tote bag against her chest, breath coming in quick bursts. Guests still lingered, whispering in clusters near the bar, their eyes following the girl as she darted past them. Her heels clattered awkwardly on the parquet floor. When she reached Susan, she was out of breath, eyes wet with tears. "I didn't know anything about this," Emma said, her voice trembling. "I swear to you, Connor never told me the truth. I thought—" She stopped, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I thought all of this was different." Susan studied her for a moment. In Emma's eyes, she saw the same bright curiosity that had always set her apart. The girl who used to bring homemade cookies when she visited on Thanksgiving, who would sit cross-legged on Susan's worn Park Slope couch, asking about teaching and reading her grandfather's old engineering journals. She had always been different from the others, less polished, more sincere. "You're not like them, Emma," Susan said quietly, her voice warm but steady. "You never treated me as an opportunity. You always came because you cared." She reached out and laid a gentle hand on Emma's trembling shoulder. The girl's skin was cold from running through the air-conditioned hall. Emma's lips quivered. "I'm so ashamed of what my brother and Lauren did," she whispered, lowering her gaze. "I don't even know how to face you." Her tote bag slid down to her elbow, spilling a flash of textbooks and a stethoscope. She bent to gather them, hands shaking. Susan crouched slightly, helping her pick up a dog-eared anatomy manual. Their fingers brushed briefly, and Susan felt an unexpected pang of tenderness. Around them, a few guests edged closer, sensing something human and unguarded amid the evening's wreckage. Someone refilled a water glass at the bar. The muted city sounds drifted in through the open door, the distant honk of a taxi, a snatch of music from a passing car. In that moment, Susan felt the frenzy of the night soften. Here was Emma, a reminder that not everything had been poisoned by greed. Susan straightened, handing Emma her book. "Don't carry their guilt," she said gently. "You're not responsible for the choices they made." Emma looked up, eyes glistening. "But I should have seen it," she murmured. "I should have asked more questions." Susan squeezed her shoulder. "Sometimes love blinds us," she replied. "The important thing is what you do now." For the first time since stepping on stage with David Ramos, Susan felt a small warmth flicker in her chest. Not triumph, but connection. In the midst of betrayal, here was a strand of loyalty still intact. She realized she wasn't entirely alone. As Emma sniffled and tried to smile through her tears, Susan's own eyes softened. "Come on," Susan said finally, gesturing toward the door. "It's a cool night out there. Let's breathe some fresh air." Emma nodded, shouldering her bag more firmly. Together they stepped out onto the sidewalk, the neon glow of New York spilling over them. The May breeze carried the scent of the Hudson and the sound of laughter from a nearby rooftop bar. For the first time all evening, Susan felt she could exhale. Betrayal still burned, but there was also this. A young woman, earnest and kind, standing beside her. A reminder that even in a night of fractures, family could still hold one honest light. An hour after leaving Hudson's Terrace, Susan and Emma found themselves tucked into a corner booth of a small cafe on 9th Avenue, a place with fogged windows and the smell of roasted beans lingering in the air. The neon sign above the door read Bluebird Coffee in flickering blue letters. Outside, the New York night pulsed with traffic, but inside it was warm, dim, and quiet, the kind of spot where conversations slowed down and confessions felt safe. Emma wrapped both hands around her mug of chamomile tea, trying to steady the tremor in her fingers. Her eyes, still red from crying, were fixed on Susan. "But why?" she asked softly, leaning forward. "Why did you hide the money all these years?" Her voice carried no accusation, only a kind of bewildered hurt. Susan stirred her espresso slowly, watching the dark liquid swirl. She exhaled before speaking, her breath visible in the chill of the air conditioning. "Because I've seen what money can do," she said finally. Her tone was even, but her eyes clouded. "I watched it destroy friendships. I watched it make good people entitled, lazy, cruel. When John was still alive, we promised each other we wouldn't let that happen to Connor. We chose to live simply so he would learn values that mattered more than dollars." As she spoke, an older man at the next table glanced over his newspaper. He nodded slightly, as though he'd heard a truth he recognized. Susan offered him a faint, tired smile before turning back to Emma. Emma blinked, digesting the words. "Connor wasn't always like this," she said, her voice catching. "When we were kids, he used to stand up for you. He told me once you were the strongest woman he knew. How did he become this person?" Her hands tightened around her mug. Susan looked down at the sugar packets lined neatly on the table, then back at Emma. "Lauren," she said without bitterness. Ambition cloaked as affection. She saw in Connor what she could use. And she paused, eyes flickering with regret. "I shielded him for too long. Paid his debts, fixed his mistakes. I thought I was protecting him. But really, I was robbing him of the chance to grow up." Emma's eyes filled again. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I feel so foolish." Susan reached across the table and covered Emma's hand with her own. Her palm was warm, steady. "You're not foolish," she said gently. "You're just learning, like the rest of us." For a moment, the cafe around them seemed to fade. The hiss of the espresso machine, the low jazz playing from a speaker, the occasional rattle of the door as someone came in. All of it became a backdrop to their quiet conversation. Susan took another sip of her espresso and closed her eyes briefly. She could still see Connor as a boy, running into her arms after school, his hair sticking up in the same cowlick he still had. The memory stung. When she opened her eyes, Emma was watching her, silent but intent. "What matters now," Susan said softly, "isn't what's been lost, but what we do with what's left." Her voice carried the weight of a lesson earned, not just spoken. It hung between them like a living thing, and Emma, swallowing hard, nodded slowly. She was not just hearing a story, she was being entrusted with a truth. Outside, a bus rumbled past, sending a wash of light across their table. Inside, in that small cafe on 9th Avenue, two women sat across from each other, one older, scarred by years of choices, one younger, still forming her own. In the middle of betrayal and loss, they found a fragile thread of understanding. And for the first time that night, Susan felt that sharing her secret had not only freed herself, but planted something hopeful in someone else. The air inside Hudson's Terrace had grown heavy again. The jazz band had quietly packed away their instruments, and most of the servers had retreated to the kitchen, whispering nervously. Susan Miller stood near the edge of the dance floor, her papers tucked back into her leather folder, trying to steady her breathing. David Ramos hovered a step behind her, checking his phone with a frown. The glow of the screen lit up his face in the dim light. The phone vibrated once, then again. David leaned closer to Susan, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Mrs. Miller," he murmured. "The manager is on his way over. He just received the cancellation notice." He glanced up toward the entrance of the hall. "He wants to speak with you directly." Susan straightened her shoulders. Her heart thudded, but her face remained calm. She caught a glimpse of Connor and Lauren across the room, two pale figures standing close together, whispering frantically. The sight of them didn't bring anger now, just a deep, quiet sadness. A few moments later, a man in a dark blue vest and a crisp white shirt appeared from behind the double doors leading to the staff corridor. He was in his late 40s, with close-cropped hair and the solid build of someone used to hard work. In his hand was a clipboard stacked with papers. He walked with the brisk authority of someone who had seen many nights like this, though perhaps none quite as dramatic. "Mrs. Miller?" he said, his accent a gentle trace of Puerto Rico. "I'm Antonio Martinez, the general manager here." He offered a polite nod, but his eyes were all business. "I'm afraid I need to confirm something. Our records show a remaining balance of $45,000 for tonight's event. The guarantee was under your personal name. Has that changed?" Guests nearby shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to listen but leaning just enough to catch the exchange. The clink of a glass somewhere in the corner punctuated the silence. Susan met Martinez's gaze squarely. "Yes," she said, her voice even. "The guarantee has been canceled. Due to the circumstances that have unfolded this evening, I can no longer be responsible for that payment. I apologize for the inconvenience." She lifted one hand slightly and gestured toward Connor and Lauren, who were now visibly panicking near the dessert table. "They are the hosts. It's their event." Martinez followed her gesture, his eyes landing on the young couple. His expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something. Recognition, maybe, or weary understanding. He had seen his share of high society meltdowns, of people who thought they could outspend their reality. He tapped the clipboard lightly with his pen. "I understand," he said finally, his tone neutral but firm. "I'll give them 24 hours to arrange another form of payment. After that, I'm afraid I'll have to begin shutting down the event and ask guests to leave. It's nothing personal, just policy." His words fell like the soft thud of a gavel. Across the room, Lauren clutched Connor's arm. "What's happening?" she hissed, her face blotchy with panic. Connor stared at Martinez, then at his mother, as if the ground had dropped out from under him. "We can't pay that," he muttered. Susan inhaled slowly. She felt the eyes of the room pressing on her, but also a strange clarity settling in. For years, the consequences of Connor's choices had been abstract. Numbers on a statement, quiet transfers from her accounts. Now, under the chandeliers of Hudson's Terrace, the reality had taken shape in the form of a man with a clipboard and a deadline. "Thank you for your professionalism, Mr. Martinez," she said quietly. "I appreciate your patience." Martinez gave another brief nod and stepped back, already reaching for his phone to notify the accounting team. The moment he turned away, the murmur of the crowd rose again, like a tide returning. For Susan, the conversation felt like the final act of a long play. No more illusions, no more hidden transactions, just the bill, the hosts, and the truth. She looked once more at Connor and Lauren. Their faces were pale, their whispered plans frantic. She wondered if, for the first time, they were feeling the weight of responsibility. In that thought was no satisfaction, only a weary hope. The paper trail had become a price tag, and the price tag had a clock. And as Susan stood there, surrounded by the fading scent of champagne and the glow of midtown lights through the windows, she knew that this night was no longer just about her freedom. It was about theirs too, if they chose to take it. The atmosphere inside Hudson's Terrace had shifted from shock to a slow, nervous hum. Guests whispered behind their hands, some already slipping phones into pockets after capturing the dramatic showdown. Others lingered near the bar, drawn to the unfolding chaos like moths to a flame. Plates of hors d'oeuvres sat untouched, the scent of shrimp cocktail mixing with the faint tang of spilled champagne on the parquet floor. Connor Miller pushed through the small crowd, his tie crooked, his eyes wide and frantic. His voice cracked as he approached Antonio Martinez, the manager still holding his clipboard. "Mr. Martinez, this is a misunderstanding," he said, his hands lifting in a helpless gesture. "My mother can't just cancel like this. We're family!" His words echoed in the hush, but carried more desperation than authority. Martinez, standing tall in his dark blue vest, glanced at the papers on his clipboard. He had the measured patience of a man who had handled hundreds of high-strung events. "Sir," he replied firmly but politely, "the guarantee was provided personally by Mrs. Miller. She has every right to withdraw it at any time. Unless another form of payment is arranged, I need to know how this balance will be settled." His accent lent a soft lilt to the hard facts, but there was no mistaking his resolve. Lauren stumbled forward next. Her once pristine white gown was now creased and stained, the hem dragging over the sticky floor. Mascara streaks ran down her cheeks, and a lock of hair clung damply to her temple. She jabbed a finger toward Martinez, her voice rising, shrill and cracked. "You can't ruin our day like this. We've planned this for months. You have no right!" Her words trembled between rage and panic. Martinez didn't flinch. He clasped his hands over the clipboard. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "I'm not ruining anything. I'm simply enforcing the contract you signed. If the balance isn't paid, we'll have to begin closing the event. That's our policy." His tone was polite but final, like a door closing. A ripple of movement swept through the guests. A couple at one table began stacking their plates, muttering apologies as they slipped out. Others stayed put, eyes wide, as though watching a stage play spiral into its final act. The scent of lilies from the centerpieces mingled with the metallic tang of tension. Someone whispered, "This is like a movie," and another guest shushed them, unable to look away. Connor's face flushed crimson. He ran both hands through his hair, pacing a small circle on the dance floor. "We can't pay that," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "We just can't." His shoulders sagged. Lauren clutched his arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "Do something," she hissed. "Fix it." But there was nothing to fix. The paper trail had ended. The safety net had been pulled. Lauren's voice broke into a sob. "This was supposed to be our beginning," she wailed. Her cry rose up into the chandeliers, bouncing back in cruel echoes. Susan stood a few yards away, watching silently. Her heart ached, but her expression remained composed. This was the consequence she had tried to prevent, laid bare in front of 150 guests. David Ramos, at her side, rested a hand on her arm, a quiet anchor. Neither of them spoke. Martinez checked his watch and looked back at the couple. "You have until noon tomorrow," he said quietly but firmly. "After that, we'll be forced to collect or shut down." His words cut through Lauren's sobs. Connor froze, staring at the floor. The room had grown so still that the hum of the refrigerator behind the bar seemed loud. Around them, guests shifted uneasily. Some whispered prayers. Others filmed discreetly. A few simply stared, transfixed by the raw spectacle of a dream unraveling. It felt less like a party and more like a public reckoning. And in the middle of it, Connor and Lauren clung to each other, not in triumph, but in collapse. Two figures caught between the lives they had planned and the reality they had built. The ballroom of Hudson's Terrace had thinned, but not emptied. Guests stood in little knots, whispering, their faces lit by the dim glow of chandeliers. Plates were abandoned on tables, the scent of cold canapes and champagne lingering like an afterthought. In the middle of the polished wood floor, Connor Miller stood with his shoulders hunched, his tie loose, his eyes glistening. He looked younger than his 34 years, like a boy caught in a storm too big for him. Susan walked toward him slowly, her heels making soft clicks on the parquet. Emma stayed just behind her, one hand pressed to her chest, watching with anxious eyes. David Ramos lingered near the exit, his phone in one hand and a leather portfolio in the other, ready to leave, but sensing this moment had to happen. Connor turned when he heard the familiar sound of his mother's steps. His face crumpled, tears streaking his cheeks. "Mom," he whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling. I don't know what to do." He took a small step toward her, like a child seeking comfort after a nightmare. Susan stopped a few feet away. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself. When she spoke, her voice was low but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "Connor," she began, "I didn't destroy anything tonight. You did, when you chose greed over love, manipulation over honesty, humiliation over respect." Each phrase landed with the weight of a stone, but her tone was not a shout. It was a calm, measured truth. Her eyes stayed on his, not hard but unwavering. Connor's breath hitched. He wiped at his face with the back of his hand. "I thought I was protecting our future," he murmured. "I thought..." But his words trailed off, lost in the hum of the room. Beside him, Lauren stood pale and shaken, her makeup streaked, her fingers twisting the fabric of her ruined gown. "What are we supposed to do now?" she asked, her voice breaking. "How are we supposed to pay? We can't..." She looked at Susan with something between fear and pleading. Susan straightened her shoulders. "You will do what adults do," she said firmly. "You will earn your living honestly. You will live within your means. You will stop expecting others to carry the cost of your choices." Her tone was not cruel, but final, like the closing of a door. Around them, a few guests nodded subtly, as though agreeing with the lesson. David stepped closer, his voice low. "Mrs. Miller," he said gently, "the paperwork is complete. Everything's signed. We can leave whenever you're ready." He gave her a look of quiet support, his presence steady as a pillar. Before Susan could answer, Emma stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her aunt. "You'll always have my respect," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "No matter what they've done. You've taught me something tonight." Her embrace was warm, solid, a balm on Susan's frayed heart. Susan closed her eyes briefly, resting her hand on the back of Emma's head. "And you," she murmured softly, "will always have mine." Her words were simple but heavy with gratitude. For a moment, the noise of the hall faded, replaced by the quiet heartbeat of two women holding on to each other. When Susan pulled back, she took one last look at Connor. He stood motionless, his hands hanging at his sides, tears slipping silently down his face. She wanted to reach out, to wipe them away like she had when he was a boy. But she knew this was not her burden anymore. This was his moment to confront the life he had built. "Goodbye, Connor," she said quietly, and then she turned toward the exit. Emma followed, her arm linked through Susan's. David walked ahead, pushing open the heavy glass door. Cool May air rushed in, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and the smell of the Hudson. Susan stepped out into the night, the weight of years sliding from her shoulders, knowing she had spoken the words that needed to be said. Behind her, in the glowing hall, her son stood among the wreckage of his own choices, the echo of her voice a lesson he would have to learn on his own. 3 days had passed since the night at Hudson's Terrace, yet the images still flickered in Susan's mind like scenes from a film she couldn't turn off. Lauren's trembling voice, Connor's tear-streaked face, the murmurs of the crowd. But on this mild May morning, her Park Slope apartment had returned to its quiet rhythm. Sunlight slanted through the lace curtains, painting soft patterns on the worn hardwood floor. The air smelled of fresh coffee and lavender from the small vase of flowers on her kitchen table. Susan stood at the window, watering her potted basil and rosemary, their green leaves glistening under the sunlight. She moved slowly, almost meditatively, her old cardigan hanging loosely over her shoulders. Each movement felt like a small ritual of grounding, a way to steady her heart after days of upheaval. A knock sounded at the door. 3 quick raps, familiar. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and opened it to find Mr. Alvarez from across the hall, holding a foil-covered plate. His eyes were kind but curious. "I saw the video online," he said in his lilting accent. "But that man, you were incredible." He offered the plate with both hands. Cinnamon rolls, fresh from the oven. Susan's lips softened into a small smile. "Thank you, Carlos," she replied. "You always know when I need something sweet." She took the warm plate, inhaling the comforting scent of cinnamon and sugar. For a moment, it felt like a reminder that not all ties were broken. Her phone buzzed again on the counter, its screen flashing with yet another call from Connor. The log showed nearly 40 missed calls since yesterday. Text messages scrolled up endlessly, some frantic, some apologetic. Lauren's name appeared repeatedly, too, her tone alternating between rage and pleading. Even Lauren's parents had come by twice, knocking on Susan's door, voices raised in the hallway, demanding a chance to fix things. She had not answered. She had nothing left to give them but silence. At 10 o'clock, David Ramos arrived, briefcase in hand, his expression composed. He stepped inside, brushing off the chill from outside. "I have updates," he said, setting his papers on the kitchen counter. "Connor and Lauren have been evicted from the Upper East Side apartment. Hudson's Terrace has filed suit for the $45,000. Their credit cards have been frozen." He paused, glancing at her with a hint of sympathy. "They're currently staying with Lauren's parents in Jersey City. 2 bedrooms, 4 people. It's not a pleasant situation." Susan poured him a cup of coffee and sat across from him. Her fingers traced the rim of her mug, but her eyes stayed steady. "Where are they now?" she asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. David repeated the details. Susan closed her eyes briefly and exhaled, a sigh that carried years of weight. "I suppose this is their rock bottom," she murmured. Then, almost absently, she rose and moved to her window garden again, misting the leaves as though tending to something that could still grow. Down on the street below, a silver hatchback pulled up. Susan noticed it through the glass, her hand pausing mid-spray. A figure stepped out. Emma Carter, her niece, clutching a canvas tote, her face pale but determined. Two young people followed behind her, one carrying a folder, the other holding a small box. Their eyes were a mixture of urgency and concern, scanning the building as if searching for a signal. Susan set the spray bottle down and straightened her shoulders. Through the glass, she saw Emma glance up at her window, then back at her companions. Whatever they were bringing, it wasn't casual. It felt like the next chapter of something still unfolding. She walked to the door, her heart beating just a little faster. In the silence of her apartment, the cinnamon rolls cooling on the counter, the basil leaves trembling faintly in the breeze, she felt both apprehension and a quiet, surprising hope. The late afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of Susan's Park Slope apartment, casting golden stripes across the living room rug. The scent of cinnamon rolls Carlos had brought earlier still lingered faintly in the air. Susan sat in her armchair, a mug of herbal tea cooling on the side table, when Emma stepped inside with two friends close behind. Emma's face was pale but determined, her ponytail slightly undone from the rush. The young woman's canvas tote bulged with papers. "Back, Susan," Emma began, her voice soft but urgent as she moved into the room. She set the tote down and pulled out a thick manila folder. "Ciao janjeu tratujem boitiec. Ko chuyen bak cambiet truo kikwamun." Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the folder on the coffee table, right next to Susan's untouched tea. Susan looked from Emma to the two other young people. Amelia, a law student from NYU with dark curls, and Joseph, Emma's classmate from Columbia, who carried a small digital recorder. Amelia's expression was tense, almost apologetic. "We thought you should see this now," she said, her voice low. Lauren has been consulting a lawyer who specializes in declaring elderly relatives legally incompetent. "We found emails, appointments, everything," Joseph added, his brows knitting together. "And that night at the terrace, we overheard her on the phone. She said, 'The old woman ruined everything, but we still have Plan B.' We recorded it." He held up the device like a fragile piece of evidence. Susan's hands tightened on the armrests. She felt the air in the room shift heavy and cold. "Plan B?" she repeated slowly, her voice nearly a whisper. Her heart thudded hard against her ribs, as if it already knew the answer. Emma reached across the coffee table and took Susan's hand in both of hers. "They're telling people you're confused, that what happened at the party proves you're losing control," she said softly. "They're trying to build a case that you're unfit to manage your own affairs. They want to use that night to take everything." Susan drew in a sharp breath, the sound loud in the quiet room. For a moment, she stared at the manila folder, its corners frayed as though it were a live thing. The betrayal felt like a wound reopening, a wound she had thought was closing. All the insults, the humiliation at the party, she had believed that was the worst. But this was deeper, colder, calculated. She rose slowly from the chair, walked to the window, and stared down at the street where children rode scooters and a vendor sold fruit from a cart. Her reflection in the glass looked older than she remembered, but her eyes still had a spark. "I thought it was just public humiliation," she murmured, mostly to herself. "I didn't know it was a trap." Emma stood and moved closer, her voice trembling now. "We're with you, Bach. You're not alone in this. We've gathered documents, recordings, witnesses. We can fight back." Susan turned back to them, her shoulders squaring. She reached for the folder, opening it carefully as if opening a sealed box of memories. Inside were printouts of emails between Lauren and a law firm, notes from phone calls, a schedule of appointments marked guardianship proceedings. Each page was another blade. She closed the folder with deliberate calm and set it down. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You've given me truth. That's more powerful than money." Her gaze swept over the three young people who had just upended her assumptions. "If they want to play this game," she continued quietly, "then they'll see what happens when you corner someone who has nothing left to lose but her dignity." In that small living room filled with fading sunlight, Susan felt the betrayal fully, but also a strange new strength rising under her skin. The trap was exposed. The next move would be hers. Part 19. Fighting Back with the Truth. The next morning, rain drizzled against the windows of Susan's Park Slope apartment, streaking the glass like silver threads. The living room smelled of fresh coffee and wet concrete from the street below. Susan sat at her dining table in a thick cardigan, sifting through a pile of neatly labeled folders when a knock at the door startled her. Emma, still in her Columbia sweatshirt, opened it. David Ramos stepped inside, his leather briefcase clutched tight, his expression grim. "Mrs. Miller," he said without preamble, lowering his umbrella into the stand. His voice carried the weight of bad news. "Connor has already filed a preliminary petition with the court to assess your competency." Susan's fingers froze on the edge of a folder. He actually did it?" she murmured, half to herself. David nodded and pulled out a thick envelope, laying it gently on the table like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. Inside are sworn statements from several guests at the engagement party. They describe you as exploding without reason, financially erratic, prone to emotional outbursts. He slid the papers across to her. The legal language was cold and clinical. Each line seemed to erase years of her dignity. Emma's eyes flashed with anger. She snatched up one of the affidavits and read aloud. "This is ridiculous. They've twisted everything. They convinced people to sign these without even explaining what it's for." Her voice cracked with frustration. Joseph, sitting by the window with his laptop, glanced up and tried to soften the mood. "But there's good news," he said with a small, steady smile. "The video from that night has gone viral. Thousands of comments are pouring in. People calling you brave, saying you're a symbol of standing up against elder abuse. You've become, well, an icon." David gave a slow nod. "It's going to be hard for them to convince a judge you're incompetent when the whole country has seen you standing calmly, speaking logically, and presenting evidence in front of 150 witnesses." Susan took a deep breath, feeling the paper cool under her fingertips. Her eyes flicked to the photograph of John on the mantel. His familiar smile seemed to steady her. "They're trying to erase me," she said quietly, almost to the picture. "But they don't know who they're dealing with." She rose from her chair and crossed the room to a cabinet she hadn't opened in years. From it, she pulled a thick blue binder, worn at the edges. Emma watched as Susan laid it on the table and flipped it open. Inside were photographs of her bruised cheek from Lauren's slap, handwritten notes of threats, bank records showing transfers to Connor, and screenshots of incriminating messages. "These are my receipts," Susan said, her voice low but steady. "Every insult, every manipulation, every plan, they're all documented. If they want a war, they'll have it. But on my terms, not theirs." Emma reached across the table, touching Susan's hand. "We're with you," she whispered. "You're not alone in this fight." Susan squeezed her hand back, her eyes sharp now, almost fierce. "Good," she said, "because I'm done being quiet. I'm going to show them what truth looks like." In that small kitchen filled with rain light and the smell of coffee, Susan felt her fear harden into resolve. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, it would be fought with her weapons: facts, patience, and an unbreakable sense of dignity. The studio lights of CBS's American True Stories were warm and bright, but Susan Miller sat upright on the cream-colored couch with the calmness of someone who had nothing left to hide. She wore a simple navy dress and a silver locket containing John's photo, her hands folded gently on her lap. The host, a woman in her 40s named Karen Hughes, leaned forward and said softly, "Susan, when did you decide to tell the world?" Susan inhaled deeply, glancing at the audience behind the cameras, rows of faces, some taking notes, some already misty-eyed. "The night of that party," she began, her voice steady but thick with memory. "I realized silence had turned into permission, and I couldn't give them permission anymore." As she spoke, CBS cut to clips from the viral video, the glittering Hudson's Terrace ballroom, the broken glass, the shocked guests, Susan's voice over the microphone. Back in the studio, there was a hush. "Family abuse isn't always a punch or a shove," Susan continued. "Sometimes it's a slow erosion of your dignity until you're too tired to stand up." Karen reached out and squeezed her hand briefly, then let her continue. "The broadcast went viral overnight. Millions watched and shared it. Newspapers called her the quiet teacher who fought back. Within weeks, the petition to declare her incompetent collapsed under public scrutiny. Judges dismissed the case, citing insufficient evidence and the mountain of counterproof Susan presented. Connor and Lauren not only lost the case but were fined for perjury and contempt of court. Lauren tried to salvage her career, opening a small PR consultancy in a co-working space in Midtown. But clients canceled after seeing the footage and reading the comments. Headlines used words like manipulation, elder abuse, and fraud. Connor drifted between short-term jobs in Jersey City, moving back and forth between his in-laws' apartment and friends' couches. 6 months after the broadcast, Susan's life looked nothing like the quiet, defensive existence she'd once lived. Her memoir, Don't Let Anyone Steal Your Dignity, hit the New York Times bestseller list. She signed books at the Union Square Barnes & Noble, hugging elderly readers who whispered their own stories to her. One woman pressed her hand and said, "You gave me courage to leave my son's house." Another man wrote her a note about finally reclaiming his bank account from a manipulative nephew. That same summer, she launched the Elder Defense Fund out of a modest office on Flatbush Avenue. Emma and her 2 friends became her first staff members, juggling classes at Columbia and volunteer work with lawyers specializing in elder rights. The office smelled of coffee and fresh paint, and the bulletin board filled with thank you letters from seniors across New York. "We've helped 87 people this month alone," Emma would say, beaming. Susan often brought homemade muffins for the volunteers, the same way she had for her students years ago. 2 years passed quickly. By then, the fund had grown into a statewide network helping more than 500 older adults regain control over their lives and assets. Susan no longer hid behind secondhand clothes or the old Toyota Corolla. She still lived simply, but on her own terms. She spoke at conferences in Washington, wrote op-eds about financial abuse, and trained social workers to recognize warning signs. Connor reached out 3 times in those 2 years, each message a short, awkward request for money. Not once did he apologize. Susan read the emails slowly, then archived them without reply. She had grieved the son she once knew and was learning to accept the man he had become. But she still set aside a trust fund for Oliver, Connor's little boy, believing that one day he might want to know the truth and find his own path. On her 65th birthday, standing by the window of her Park Slope apartment, Susan looked out at the spring trees in Prospect Park and felt a strange lightness. The night she had stood up for herself at Hudson's Terrace no longer haunted her as a scandal, but lived in her as a turning point. She whispered to John's photo on the mantel, "We did it. We're free." In the kitchen, Emma laughed with volunteers, brewing coffee for another day of work. The apartment buzzed with new energy, a blend of activism and family. Susan closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the sound. She had not only taken back her dignity, she had built a life that gave dignity to others. And that, she realized, was the true freedom she had been waiting for. As spring sunlight poured through the wide Park Slope windows, Susan watched Emma and the volunteers bustling in her kitchen, their laughter echoing off the old brick walls. It felt like the apartment itself had exhaled a long-held breath. All the years of quiet endurance, all the nights of doubt and secrecy had brought her here, not to wealth or revenge, but to a life of meaning. She traced her fingers over the edge of her locket, thinking of John, of the shy boy Connor once was, of every senior who had walked into her office with tears in their eyes and left with their heads held higher. Looking back, the journey seemed almost unreal. From the night of the engagement party at Hudson's Terrace to the viral broadcast on national television, Susan had walked through humiliation, betrayal, and fear. Yet she had turned silence into action, and action into a movement that protected hundreds. Her story was not about punishing a son or a daughter-in-law. It was about reclaiming dignity when everyone assumes you will stay quiet. In her mind, she whispered, "This is the legacy, John. Not the money, not the house. This." She stepped into the living room, where a stack of letters from grateful seniors waited to be answered. "Each one is a victory," she murmured. Emma looked up and smiled. "We're changing lives, Aunt Susan." And Susan knew Emma was right. The past could not be undone, but the future could be built stronger. If Susan's story moved you, take a moment to reflect on it. Share this video with someone who might need courage, and don't forget to like it so more people can hear stories like this. Subscribe to our channel to follow new journeys of resilience, and leave a comment saying, "I'm listening," so we can stay connected and keep walking this path together. Stories like Susan's remind us that dignity is not a luxury. It is a right, and protecting it begins with a single brave step. See you in the next video.